last week we had a real good crowd.
Yep.
And you can't ever tell. This just that time of year. And I don't blame people for doing what, going places and doing things. And glad they can do it. But we're going to continue on tonight with Hebrews chapter 8, and we'll go through most of it tonight and get that done. Just got a text from John. He said he's sick and in the bed. So anyway, let's start off with verse number 1. And we'll just go down through here and read and then come back and cover it. Now the point in what we're saying is this. This is out of the English Standard Version. So he's making his point. One who is seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven. In other words, the point in what we're saying is that we have such a high priest, one who is seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven, a minister in the holy places, in the true tent that the Lord set up, not man. It's funny, to me, he's not talking about temple, he's talking about tabernacle. And he's saying the tent instead of the temple. He's saying the tabernacle, the tent. For every high priest is appointed to offer gifts and sacrifices. Thus it is necessary for the priest also to have something to offer. Now, if he were on earth, he would not be a priest at all, since there are priests who offer gifts according to the law. They serve a copy. Look at that, a copy and a shadow of the heavenly thing. For when Moses was about to erect the tent, again he's saying the tabernacle, the tent, he was instructed by God, see that you make everything according to the pattern that was shown you on the mountain. But as it is, Christ has obtained a ministry that is much more excellent than the old covenant, than the old, as the covenant he mediates is better, since it's enacted on better promises. For if that first covenant had been faultless, there would be no occasion to look for a second. For he finds fault with them when he says, behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will establish a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not like the covenant that I made with their fathers on the day when I took them by the hand and brought them out of Egypt. For they did not continue in my covenant. So I show no concern for them, declares the Lord. For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel. After those days, declares the Lord, I will put my laws into their minds and write them on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. And they shall not teach each one his neighbor, and each one his brother, saying, know the Lord. For they shall all know me, from the least of them to the greatest. Excuse me. For I will be merciful toward their iniquities, and I will remember their sins no more. In speaking of a new covenant, still talking about the point that in verse 1, he said, now the point of all this, so he's saying in verse 13, in speaking of a new covenant, he makes the first one obsolete. And what is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away. So that's the point of everything he had said. All the stuff about Melchizedek, and all the stuff about the priesthood, and all the stuff about the supremacy of Christ, and all the stuff about he's not an angel, but he's higher than an angel. Now, he's not a prophet. All this stuff. The point is that he is the mediator of a new covenant. He's a priest. He's not like a priest from the line of Aaron. He is different. He's from the lineage. He's likened to Melchizedek. So he then because he says that there's a new covenant, so there's a new high priest, and so therefore the old one is no longer in effect. He says it's obsolete. So when you know what happens when something's obsolete, they come up with something new. You can't get parts for something if something's obsolete, right? You can't maintain it. You can't keep it. That is why I believe that you no longer see an attempt by even the Jewish people who still believe in the Mosaic covenant and what Moses gave. They don't attempt to even keep it, because there is no temple, there is no tabernacle, there is no place where you can offer sacrifice for sin. We talked about this last week when Ronnie asked a question about that. Well, then how do they get redemption? And they don't really look for redemption. They practice their religion. They're not looking for it. A lot of Jewish people don't even believe that there's a heaven or a hell. They just believe that they're Jewish people and they practice their being Jewish. So, it's obsolete. It's done away with. Now, again, a lot of people would argue with me right now and say, well, no, now, they point me to some other places, talking about the law and this and right here, and say, well, what about that and what about this? I'm not saying that the law in itself was not good, but it didn't work. Okay, that was the fault with it. So when you look at what he says, and I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, but that's why I read everything. When you see what he said this will be the new one. Okay? I will write it on your hearts and in your minds. And you won't have to have somebody that you go to and they would tell you, well, now it says do this, don't do that, and follow this way. On this day you got to rest. On this day you can't eat this thing, you can't do that. He said you won't need that anymore. He said nobody will have to teach you because it's in your heart. John 14 is what Jesus is saying in John 14. He said, now when Holy Spirit comes, he will teach you. And Jesus said, you don't need anybody else to teach you what is right and wrong. Now, see, prior to this, if I sinned, I had to go look and see where it was written. Well, oh yeah, that's a sin, right? I could look at the 10 and say, oh yeah, well, I shouldn't have done that. Or there were some other laws. Well, I violated that law. But it was written somewhere, right? Now, it is written in my heart, okay? So we all know how this works, right? When I do something that is wrong, that violates what is right, Holy Spirit comes to me and says, taps me on the shoulder. So I don't have to go find it. I ain't got to go find the place it was written down. He comes and he says, Don, and you know better than that. And that's where when John in 1 John, when he says, when you sin, he's talking to the church, when we sin, if we confess our sin, he's faithful and just to forgive our sin, cleanse us from all unrighteousness. How do we know we sin? Because the Holy Spirit will tell us, right? He'll lead. If in Galatians it says, if you walk in the Spirit, if you live in the Spirit, you won't walk after, you won't do what the flesh desires. That's the rule of thumb. If I walk in the Spirit, I won't do what my flesh. See, my flesh was sinful. The Spirit is life. So that's what he's saying. So he's saying that traditionally, see, when we look at all of this down through here, he's still developing his his teaching for the Hebrew people to understand and for us to understand. He's still developing that. And he is saying, and right off the bat, he says he's seated at the right hand of the Father in heaven. Now, traditionally, priests don't sit with the king. Traditionally, priests serve the people and they serve the king. That's what priests do, right? Everybody agree with that? But Jesus is seated with the king in his place because in the order of Melchizedek, he was both priest and king. And he still is both. So he is a royal priesthood. And Peter said, you are. He said, we are a royal priesthood as well. We're separate, we're different, but we're not like Jesus. We're not seated at the right hand. When you're seated by a royalty, which represents authority, that means that you share that authority with that person. When you're seated especially on the right hand, so if a king sits down and his queen sits beside him, they share. I mean, they have there's a head, but there's the ultimate. They share. So when he is sitting, he's seated like a crown prince, but really a king, like a co-king. To help us better understand, when he's seated, he's equal to. Y'all got me? So then, that completely makes everything different from the other priests. So then he says the true tent set up by God and not man. So God gave Moses the blueprints, Jimmy, and said, this is how you are to make it. It's supposed to be oriented toward the north or oriented toward the east, right? So that when the sun comes up, it's shining on it. One part of it is going to be in the sun, and the sun's going to set on the other part of it. Then you got the north and south, and then you put it in the center of the camp. So then he said, you make one outer part of the tent, then you make another part of the tent, and then you make another part of the tent. And in each one, there are different things that takes place, right? So he gave him the blueprint for the tent, the tabernacle is what he's talking about. So it was set up by men. Now, if you will see, when I was writing my notes, I wrote myself a note that said, everything on earth that in the tabernacle is a replica of what God is. A replica is of what is at where God is seated in the heavenly place where God is seated. That tabernacle is a replica of what is actually there. Do you understand what I'm saying? So when you look at what was on earth by man, it was imperfect. But what is in heaven by God, divine, has no flaws, right? And so when we looked on down, he said, see in verse, let's see, in verse 5, he says, they serve a copy and a shadow of the heavenly things. Okay, and so he said, Moses got the instructions, but whatever the tabernacle is on earth, the temple is on earth, is a shadow of the replica of what, so it replicates what is actually in heaven. And so therefore it is imperfect by its very nature. So he introduced, I believe, a new concept in all of his teaching right here. In his letter, in his explanation, all of a sudden he brings the tabernacle back into play. He don't even talk about the temple, but he introduces that. and brings that into the discussion. Because it is to prove the point that what is on earth and what preceded it was inferior to what Jesus had done. So it's a better covenant and a better promise. If you were in the old covenant and you sinned, you would immediately have to pay for it in some way or another. And some of the sins that you did, you could find forgiveness. Some of them you had to pay for with life, right? If you kill somebody, you would die. If you sin certain things, you would die. But there's always a shedding of blood. But in the New Testament, though, Jesus paid the price. So it's a better covenant now. We still sin. We still held accountable for the sin, but we can receive grace and mercy and judgment. We don't receive it. We don't receive the justice and the penalty. He did. So the old covenant, that was the fault of the old covenant. And the old covenant was that you couldn't find it. You couldn't keep it. You couldn't. Somebody was always having to tell you. And when men got involved in this, Janet, they kept changing things a lot of times. And Jesus said that. He said, y'all putting these heavy weights on all these people. He said, you're putting burdens on them that you don't carry your own self. That's what he said. Because when men got involved in it, they brought people into bondage. And we talked about that a little bit last week. You know, men, why would you do that? Well, why would you have a priesthood? Why would you want to go back? So control, right? We talked about that. So that was the fault. The promise, though, is that the law is on our hearts. And Holy Spirit teaches us. And so by that very reason, it is much, 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 much better. We have the grace of God. The old one is obsolete and it vanishes away. In Exodus 25, verse 4, I'm going to go back to what we had said about verse 2. Moses was shown this model of the tabernacle on the mountain of God. That's where he showed it to him. That's where he gave him the instructions. And then you see it in several more different places where it is just a shadow of things. Now, this concept of a new covenant is not just found here in Hebrews. Jesus talked about the new covenant, and you can find it in 3 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. When he was breaking the bread and giving the wine, what we did Sunday, he said, this is the new covenant in my blood. So he established the new covenant at the Last Supper. He said, hey guys, this is the new covenant. And then 1 Corinthians 11 talks about it. 2 Corinthians 3 says that we are ministers of the new covenant. So that when we say new covenant, somebody said, well, I don't know, the old covenant was good, blah, 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 blah. You know, I'm just saying, I don't argue with people. But it's pretty plain right here. I just read stuff in context, Jen, and I take it for what it says. So right here, he said the old covenant had a fault. And then he said, then the old covenant is obsolete. Right? He said right here in chapter 8 that the new covenant was better. Why? Because it had a better promise. So you can tell me all what you want to about, well, you shouldn't eat pork and you should do this. And I agree with you. Pork probably not good for you. But there ain't no penalty for me for eating, except it might clog my arteries up. Huh? I don't know. I'm just saying, but why would you want to do that? But I tell you, you still get people that want to take you back to the Torah and want you to walk that out. And I don't understand it, but I don't argue. So the continuity with the Old Testament that we find with the New Testament is in one word. Okay? When you see the law and you see what Jesus did, what makes them continuous, the continuity, what makes them both flow from one to the other, similar, is this one thing, the word covenant. The Old Testament, that was a covenant he made with Abraham, covenant he made with Moses. And Jesus said, this is the new covenant. So, covenant, all right now, watch this. So, in order to, you can make a covenant. Now, we can make covenants now. We can legally make a covenant. And when you make a covenant, there's usually something swapped. Ronnie talked about that. When we make one, there's usually money, swapped. But in the Old Testament, and in those times, when you said covenant, that means there was going to be a sacrifice that was going to be made. Y'all understand what I'm saying? So he didn't say, well, this is a new contract I have with you. He didn't say that. He said, this is a new covenant that I have with you. Which means somebody had to die. Something had to die. Blood had to be shed. And usually it was both people. Y'all ever do any, when you were little boys or little girls, y'all ever be blood brothers with somebody? Y'all ever do it? Y'all ever do it? We did. We would say, we seen on a cowboy movie or something. We would do it. That's what you did in a covenant. Both sides. Remember when God walked through the parts of the animal, that was a precursor. That was a prophetic thing where God would make a sacrifice. He would provide the sacrifice. He would officiate the sacrifice. He would offer up the sacrifice. He would do all of that. So that is what our new covenant. So that's why he uses these words. Why? Because Jesus used the word covenant. And because the people understood, especially Hebrew people, covenant. We don't understand it like they understood. But if we do it and see, and that's why I think it's important a lot of times for us to study covenant, what it is, a biblical covenant, what it means. Because when we do, we can better understand what Jesus did for us.